The morning fog rolled across New York Harbor in dense gray sheets, turning the Manhattan skyline into a series of half-remembered silhouettes. Marina Kovac stood at the base of the Statue of Liberty, her breath visible in the October cold, running through her mental checklist with the methodical precision that had defined her career. Maintenance Port 17, accessible through the service corridor beneath the observation deck, had been flagging intermittent voltage irregularities for 3 weeks. Nothing critical, nothing that warranted emergency protocols, just the kind of persistent anomaly that kept her awake at night until she resolved it. She'd been with the National Park Service for 8 years, the last 4 assigned exclusively to Liberty Island's infrastructure systems. While tourists photographed Lady Liberty's oxidized copper skin and contemplated freedom's symbolism, Marina mapped the monument's circulatory system. The electrical conduits threading through Eiffel's iron skeleton, the HVAC networks maintaining climate control in the museum spaces, the security grids monitoring every square foot of the 30-acre island. She understood this structure the way a surgeon understands anatomy, could diagnose malfunctions by the pattern of diagnostic lights, predict failures before they occurred. Her apartment in Brooklyn was a 15-minute ferry ride away, but she'd stopped thinking of it as home years ago. The studio contained a bed, a coffee maker, and a desk supporting 3 monitors displaying real-time telemetry from the statue's systems. She had no pets, no plants requiring care, no relationships demanding the unpredictable maintenance that human connections entailed. Systems were comprehensible. People were chaos dressed in skin. The diagnostic scanner in her toolkit hummed as she descended into the statue's interior. The beam of her headlamp cutting through darkness that smelled of old metal and stone. Down here, surrounded by the geometric certainty of Eiffel's engineering, she felt the nearest thing to peace her mind aloud. Every beam calculated, every rivet purposeful, every load-bearing element precisely where structural integrity demanded it be. There was comfort in that kind of order, beauty in its absolute predictability. Above her, somewhere in the early morning darkness, interstellar comet 3I-ATLAS was completing its trajectory through the inner solar system. Marina had read about it. Everyone had. The 3rd interstellar visitor confirmed by astronomers, currently visible as a faint smudge against Orion's belt. The news coverage had been enthusiastic but superficial. The usual speculation about alien origins quickly dismissed by scientists explaining the mundane reality of ice and rock ejected from distant stellar systems. Marina had filed it under interesting but irrelevant and returned her attention to voltage regulators and circuit protection systems. The anomaly began at 6:47 a.m., 3 minutes after astronomical closest approach, though Marina wouldn't learn that correlation until later. She was examining junction box J17 when her diagnostic scanner died. Not a battery failure. The unit simply went dark, its screen fading to black as though something had drained every electron from its circuits. Her headlamp flickered, stabilized, then extinguished completely. Emergency backup lights throughout the service corridor winked out in sequence, darkness rushing through the space like water filling a compartment. Marina stood perfectly still, controlling the spike of adrenaline, letting her eyes adjust. Except there was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was absolute, the kind of lightless void that made her spatial awareness meaningless. She reached for her phone, knowing before her fingers touched the dead screen that it wouldn't respond. Every electronic device she carried had become an inert assemblage of materials, as useless as rocks. Then the framework began to glow. The light emerged from the iron skeleton itself, starting as a faint blue-green phosphorescence, where the vertical support beams met the horizontal cross-bracing. Not reflected light. Not any kind of electrical discharge she recognized, but a cold luminescence emanating from within the metal's crystalline structure. Geometric patterns materialized in the darkness, angular lines connecting points of brightness in configurations that hurt to look at directly. The patterns pulsed, contracting and expanding with a rhythm that felt organic, almost respiratory, as though the monument's skeleton had developed something resembling breath. Marina's rational mind offered explanations: piezoelectric effects from structural stress, St. Elmo's fire generated by atmospheric conditions, some kind of chemical reaction in the metal's oxidation layers. Each hypothesis collapsed under the evidence. The light was too bright, too structured, too deliberately patterned. The geometry didn't conform to crystalline formations or electrical discharge pathways. And underneath the visual impossibility, she felt something else, a low-frequency vibration that resonated in her chest cavity, a pressure that seemed to exist somewhere between sound and sensation. The service corridor's emergency phone, a hardwired landline immune to the electronic death that had claimed everything else, should have remained functional. When Marina reached the unit mounted on the corridor wall, she found the handset warm to the touch, its plastic housing deformed slightly, as though exposed to heat. The dial tone was gone. Whatever had killed the electronics hadn't discriminated between wireless and hardwired systems. She needed to reach the surface, needed to understand the scope of this event, needed data to replace the hypotheses multiplying uselessly in her thoughts. Marina moved through the corridors by the framework's alien glow, navigating passages she'd memorized through years of routine maintenance. The geometric light patterns tracked her movement, or seemed to, brightness intensifying in sections of framework as she passed beneath them. Coincidence, her mind insisted, pattern recognition creating meaning from randomness. Except the patterns weren't random. When she emerged onto the observation platform, Manhattan was dark. The blackout extended across lower Manhattan in a perfect circle, its boundary visible as a sharp demarcation between darkness and the normal glow of early morning city lights. Everything within approximately 3 miles of Liberty Island had lost power. No streetlights, no building illumination, no vehicle headlights moving along the FDR Drive. The circle's precision was impossible. Power grids didn't fail in geometric patterns. Electrical infrastructure didn't respect mathematical boundaries. Yet there it was, a hemisphere of darkness centered exactly on the monument where she stood. Behind her, through the museum's observation windows, the torch was blazing. Not the floodlights that normally illuminated Bartholdi's copper flame, but something emerging from within the structure itself. The same blue-green luminescence she'd witnessed in the framework, but concentrated, intensified, pulsing with that respiratory rhythm that made her think of breathing, of communication, of signals propagating across impossible distances. Marina's hands were shaking. A physiological response, she observed, with detached clinical interest. Fear, her autonomic nervous system concluded, though her conscious mind hadn't yet accepted what her senses were reporting. Because accepting it meant abandoning every framework of understanding that had made the world comprehensible. It meant acknowledging that her carefully maintained systems of knowledge, her faith in rational explanation and technical solutions, were insufficient to explain what was happening 3 feet behind her. The National Park Service emergency protocols for Liberty Island covered fire, terrorism, natural disasters, even nuclear incidents. There was no protocol for this, no checklist, no decision tree, no systematic approach to a phenomenon that violated the fundamental assumptions underlying every system she'd ever trusted. She stood on the observation platform as dawn broke over the darkened city, watching geometric light patterns pulse from the monument's skeleton, and felt the bedrock certainty of her worldview beginning to crack. The statue she'd maintained for 4 years, whose systems she'd believed she understood completely, had just revealed itself as something she'd never comprehended at all. Somewhere above her, interstellar comet 3I-ATLAS continued its trajectory through the inner solar system, carrying away velocity it had stolen from Earth's orbit during its gravitational flyby. The exchange was insignificant on cosmic scales, a few meters per second borrowed and never returned. But that brief proximity had triggered something, had activated a system waiting dormant in Eiffel's iron framework for over a century, and Marina Kovac, systems engineer, rationalist, accidental witness to the impossible, stood at the threshold of understanding that some questions couldn't be answered with diagnostic scanners and technical specifications. The framework blazed behind her, transmitting its incomprehensible message to the morning sky, and Marina finally accepted that her ordinary world had ended the moment she descended into darkness 3 hours earlier. Whatever came next would require something her training had never prepared her for, the ability to make decisions when all her systems of understanding had failed. The federal quarantine transformed Liberty Island into a cage of bureaucratic authority within 18 hours. Marina watched from the museum's observation windows as Coast Guard cutters established a perimeter at precisely 1 nautical mile, their white hulls circling the monument in slow, deliberate arcs. Helicopters marked with Department of Homeland Security insignia maintained aerial surveillance, their rotors creating rhythmic pressure waves she could feel through the building's structure. The island had become a classified site, its normal operations suspended, its staff replaced by personnel who wore earpieces and wouldn't make eye contact. Dr. Chen Wei arrived on the last civilian ferry before the exclusion zone went into effect, carrying 3 aluminum cases and a National Science Foundation credential that should have granted him access. The NSA liaison at the dock checkpoint detained him for 40 minutes, searching his equipment with methodical hostility before Marina intervened using her infrastructure access privileges. Those privileges wouldn't last long. She could see the calculation in the federal agent's eyes, the assessment of when her usefulness would be outweighed by her potential obstruction. Chen Wei's handshake was dry and precise, his grip calibrated to convey confidence without aggression. He was younger than she'd expected from his published work on exotic stellar compositions, maybe 35, with wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the monument's glow, and a caffeine tremor in his left hand that suggested he'd been awake as long as she had. His credentials were impeccable: MIT astrophysics doctorate, 3 years with the Breakthrough Listen initiative scanning for technosignatures, current position mapping the mineral composition of interstellar objects using spectroscopic analysis. He'd been studying Comet 3I-ATLAS since its detection 14 months earlier, tracking its approach with instruments sensitive enough to detect molecular variations in its outgassing patterns. They met in the maintenance access corridor where Marina had first witnessed the framework's transformation, speaking in voices kept deliberately low beneath the hum of portable generators the military had deployed to power their monitoring equipment. Chen Wei's first words bypassed all professional courtesy and went directly to the conclusion his data demanded. "The comet's mineral signature matches the crystalline lattice in the framework," he said, unpacking a laptop from one of his cases. "Not similar, identical, same trace element ratios, same crystalline structure, same spectroscopic absorption lines. Whatever's embedded in this monument came from the same source as 3I-ATLAS." Marina felt her remaining skepticism collapse under the weight of that correlation. She'd been maintaining a fragile possibility that the phenomenon might have terrestrial explanations, some unknown property of Eiffel's iron, reacting to atmospheric conditions or seismic activity. Chen Wei's data eliminated that refuge. The framework's luminescence wasn't malfunction or coincidence, it was response, recognition, a designed system activating when its triggering conditions were met. They needed a way to mark this location across millennia, Chen Wei continued, his fingers pulling up spectroscopic data that meant nothing to Marina's engineering background, but clearly meant everything to him. The statue's been here since 1886. The comet's been traveling for at least 10,000 years, probably longer. Someone launched that object knowing exactly when and where it would pass through this solar system, knowing it would trigger a beacon they'd already placed here. The conspiracy implications should have been Marina's first concern. Who placed it? How had it remained hidden? What did this mean for human history? But her mind kept returning to systems analysis, to the elegant engineering of a communication protocol that could function across geological timeframes. A beacon that could remain dormant for centuries, requiring no maintenance, no power source, waiting for a specific molecular signature to pass within activation range. The sophistication required for that kind of system made humanity's most advanced technology look like stone tools. "We're not supposed to be having this conversation," Marina said, watching through the corridor's security camera sightlines for approaching federal personnel. "In about 6 hours, they're going to restrict my access to this facility and assign me to supervised administrative duties while they bring in their own specialists." "Then we have 6 hours to get ahead of them," Chenwei replied, already connecting cables to junction boxes Marina had opened during her maintenance work. "I need direct access to the framework's electromagnetic output. If this is a communication system, it's transmitting in spectrums we're not monitoring. The visible light patterns are probably just waste radiation. The actual data stream will be in frequencies optimized for interstellar propagation." They worked with the focused urgency of people who understood their opportunity was temporary. Chenwei's equipment transformed the maintenance corridor into an impromptu laboratory, sensors adhering to the iron framework with magnetic coupling, oscilloscopes displaying waveforms that pulsed in time with the geometric light patterns. Marina provided the infrastructure access and spatial knowledge, identifying optimal monitoring points and rerouting power from non-essential systems to feed Chenwei's analysis equipment. The transmission structure began revealing itself in layers. Surface level, the visible luminescence cycling through patterns that resembled nothing in Earth's communication protocols. Beneath that, electromagnetic radiation spanning from extreme low frequency to gamma rays, modulated with precision that suggested information density far beyond human data compression algorithms. And underneath everything, something Chenwei's instruments could barely detect: gravitational wave fluctuations at the threshold of measurement, as though the beacon were manipulating space-time itself to encode information. "It's not just broadcasting," Chenwei said, staring at readouts that showed data streams exceeding petabyte-scale information density. "It's quantum entangled. The transmission is arriving simultaneously at the destination regardless of distance. No light-speed delay. Which means whoever receives this isn't just getting coordinates. They're getting real-time updates on conditions here." Marina felt the implications settle into her chest like physical weight. First contact scenarios always included delay, time for preparation, distance as a buffer for human decision-making. If the transmission was instantaneous, if the intended recipients already knew everything happening on Liberty Island, then humanity's response time had already expired. The decision trees she'd been constructing mentally, the systematic approach to evaluating options, all of it was obsolete. They were being observed, evaluated, their actions monitored by intelligence that operated outside the physical constraints she'd believed were universal laws. The Ellis Island archivist appeared on the 3rd day of quarantine, arriving with federal documentation that identified her as part of the historical consultation team. Her name was Dr. Sarah Okonkwo. Her credentials listed expertise in immigration history and cultural preservation, and Marina knew immediately that the credentials were cover for something else. The signs were subtle, The way Okonkwo's eyes tracked security camera positions, the deliberate casualness of her questions about facility access, the fact that someone with her stated expertise had been granted entry to a classified site in the middle of an intelligence operation. They met in the museum's library, a small climate-controlled room housing documents related to the statue's construction and restoration. Okonkwo waited until they were alone before producing a leather portfolio containing photographs of cuneiform tablets, not the museum pieces accessible to casual researchers, but restricted artifacts from Ellis Island storage archives, material classified during the Cold War for reasons the documentation didn't specify. These were discovered in 1952 during foundation excavation for the Immigration Museum, Okonkwo said, arranging the photographs across the library table with the precision of someone revealing critical evidence. Nobody knew what to make of them. Sumerian tablets, dating to approximately 2800 BCE, found buried beneath fill material that should have been undisturbed since the last ice age. The tablets reference something called the Beacon in the Harbour of Welcomes, a place where the Cedars would listen for the children's maturation. The army classified them as potentially threatening to national security, and they've been locked away ever since. Marina studied the photographs, seeing nothing but angular cuneiform impressions that could mean anything or nothing. But Okonkwo's body language was communicating something the artifacts alone couldn't. Tension held in her shoulders, a vocal cadence suggesting she'd rehearsed this revelation. The careful monitoring of Marina's reaction to gauge whether trust was warranted. "Why are you showing me this?" Marina asked, abandoning pretense of casual academic interest. "Because the people running this operation want to weaponize whatever's happening here," Okonkwo replied, her voice dropping below the ambient noise of the building's ventilation system. "And there's a smaller group who think first contact should be approached with something other than immediate militarization. We need allies who understand what's actually at stake." The conspiracy beneath the conspiracy, Marina thought. Federal factions competing for control of humanity's first encounter with non-human intelligence, each pushing agendas that had nothing to do with the scientific or philosophical implications. The systematic approach would be to report this contact, follow protocols, maintain chain of command. But the systematic approach assumed the system was designed to handle novel problems rather than suppress them for political advantage. Chen Wei joined them after Okonkwo's initial revelation. His arrival, coordinated through what Marina was beginning to understand, was a network of researchers who'd been planning for this scenario long before the beacon activated. He brought translations of the Sumerian texts, interpretations that described the Anunnaki not as mythological deities, but as an extrasolar civilization that had visited Earth during humanity's evolutionary infancy. The tablet spoke of genetic modification, of accelerated cognitive development, of markers left behind to signal when human civilization reached threshold awareness, the capacity to recognize its place in a larger cosmic community. They seeded multiple systems, Chen Wei explained, his finger tracing cuneiform passages that described sister gardens across the eternal dark. Earth was one of several evolutionary experiments. The beacon was supposed to activate when we developed sufficient technology to recognize the signal for what it was. But it activated early. Our current technology is barely adequate to analyze what's happening, let alone understand it, which means either their timeline was wrong or something else triggered the activation. The comet, Marina realized. The proximity trigger wasn't about human readiness. It was purely mechanical, a design system executing its programming regardless of whether its creators' assumptions about human development timelines were accurate. They were facing first contact not because humanity was ready, but because orbital mechanics and ancient engineering had aligned according to specifications set millennia before human civilization existed. The NSA cryptographers established their operations center in the statue's pedestal level, installing equipment that turned the historical exhibition space into a signals intelligence facility. Marina watched their setup through security camera feeds, seeing the familiar patterns of military intelligence procedures, compartmentalized work areas, restricted information flow, personnel rotations designed to prevent comprehensive understanding of the project from forming in any single individual's mind. They were treating the beacon like an enemy transmission to be cracked and exploited, rather than a message to be understood and considered. Corporate intelligence operatives appeared in the fourth day, their presence marked by the sudden increase in credentialed consultants from aerospace contractors and defense technology firms. Marina recognized the type, people who treated information as property and innovation as something to be captured and monetized. They moved through the facility with the confidence of individuals who believed federal authority was subordinate to shareholder value, asking questions about the beacon's power generation and transmission mechanisms that revealed their priorities. They weren't interested in the message's content or implications. They wanted to know if the technology could be reverse-engineered, patented, and sold. Marina found herself navigating an impossible political landscape, cooperating enough to maintain access while resisting enough to protect the integrity of Chen Wei's research. She provided infrastructure support to the NSA team while carefully omitting mention of the quantum entanglement properties Chen Wei had discovered. She answered corporate questions about the framework's physical properties while misdirecting inquiries about the crystalline lattice's composition. She was becoming something her training had never prepared her for. Not an engineer implementing established procedures, but an operator making real-time decisions in contested information space. The breakthrough came on the sixth night, when Chen Wei's decryption algorithms finally achieved coherence with the transmission's base layer protocols. Marina was present when the first translated data appeared on his monitors, watching as streams of symbols resolved into something approximating human linguistic structures. Not English, not any terrestrial language, but concepts rendered in mathematical relationships that could be understood by any intelligence capable of recognizing patterns in physical laws. "It's not just transmitting coordinates," Chen Wei said, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who'd just had their worldview fundamentally restructured. "It's downloading an archive. The entire genetic and technological history of the Anunnaki's seeding program across multiple star systems. Solutions to climate engineering, energy generation, interstellar propulsion, everything a civilization needs to transition from planetary to cosmic existence. This is humanity's welcome packet." Marina scrolled through data streams that would take decades to fully analyze, seeing blueprints for fusion reactors that operated at room temperature, terraforming protocols that could reverse atmospheric collapse, medical technologies that addressed aging at the cellular level. Everything humanity had been struggling to solve through incremental research was here solved, provided as freely as someone leaving instruction manuals for house guests. The implications were staggering. Not just technological advancement, but the validation that humanity's struggles weren't unique, that other intelligences had faced and overcome the same existential challenges that currently threatened Earth's civilization. "This justifies allowing the contact," Marina said, feeling something like hope breach her analytical detachment for the first time since the phenomenon began. "If we can access this archive, study it, implement even a fraction of these solutions." "The Anunnaki ships launched 3 days ago," Chen Wei interrupted. displaying astronomical data that showed gravitational distortions consistent with massive objects accelerating to relativistic velocity. The quantum-entangled response to our beacon activation, they received it instantaneously and began their journey immediately. Estimated arrival time, 47 years. 47 years, less than a human lifetime. Time enough for the generation currently alive to witness first physical contact, to live through the transition from planetary isolation to cosmic integration. Marina's daughter, if she had one, would be older at contact than Marina was now. The timeline made the stakes immediate. This wasn't a problem for distant future generations to handle. This was the defining event of current human civilization. But Chen Wei's expression held something beyond the wonder Marina was feeling, a tension in his jaw that suggested the revelation wasn't complete. "The download is accelerating," he continued, displaying transmission rate graphs that showed exponential increase. "The beacon isn't just sending a welcome packet, it's preparing for their arrival. And the signal's electromagnetic output is increasing proportionally. At current acceleration rates, the beacon will be visible from Earth's surface in 11 days, bright enough to be photographed by civilian astronomers. At that point, containment becomes impossible. Humanity will know first contact is happening, whether global leadership is ready to manage that disclosure or not." Marina felt the false victory collapse into something far more complex. The archive wasn't just knowledge freely given, it was a test. The Anunnaki were measuring humanity's response to the beacon, evaluating whether current human civilization possessed the wisdom and maturity to integrate cosmic knowledge without self-destructing. And humanity's immediate response had been military quarantine, intelligence agency turf wars, and corporate exploitation schemes. The systematic answer, containment and controlled study, was itself the wrong answer to the test they were being given. She stood in the maintenance corridor beneath the pulsing framework, watching geometric light patterns encode information that represented millennia of accumulated extraterrestrial knowledge, and understood that her role had transformed from technical maintenance to something approaching existential choice. The beacon could be destroyed. The crystalline lattice was fragile, vulnerable to physical disruption. She had the access and knowledge to disable it before civilian disclosure made containment impossible. But destruction would send its own message to the approaching Anunnaki, a declaration that humanity had encountered the threshold of cosmic citizenship and chosen isolation through fear. The download continued. Petabytes of data accumulating in the quantum-encrypted streams Chen Wei's equipment was barely capable of monitoring. Somewhere in the archives was the answer to climate collapse, the solution to energy scarcity, the key to human civilization surviving its own technological adolescence. And somewhere in federal command structures, decisions were being made about weaponization and exploitation that would define humanity's cosmic reputation for generations to come. Marina Kovac, systems engineer, accidental gatekeeper of Earth's first contact scenario, stood at the threshold of a decision no systematic protocol could resolve. 47 years until arrival, 11 days until public disclosure, and zero precedent for determining whether humanity was ready for the transformation the beacon represented, or whether her obligation was to protect human civilization from changes it might not survive. The pressure arrived in bureaucratic language wrapped around existential stakes. Pentagon liaison officers appeared on day 9, carrying classification stamps and threat assessment matrices that reduced first contact to a series of tactical scenarios. They spoke in the vocabulary of force projection and strategic advantage, treating the beacon as though it were an enemy weapons platform broadcasting targeting coordinates. Marina sat through briefings where military intelligence analysts presented slides showing hypothetical invasion timelines, resource extraction scenarios, technological subjugation projections, every possibility except the one the archive data actually suggested. We cannot afford to interpret benevolent intent from advanced capability, declared Colonel Marcus Reeves, his uniform decorated with ribbons, representing conflicts that suddenly seemed provincial compared to the cosmic stakes now in play. Every terrestrial civilization that encountered technologically superior forces learned the same lesson. Capability equals threat, regardless of stated intentions. The Anunnaki possess interstellar travel, quantum communication, genetic engineering millennia beyond our comprehension. If they view Earth as a resource or strategic position, our defensive options range from inadequate to non-existent. The logic was impeccable if you accepted its foundational assumptions. That first contact followed the same patterns as terrestrial colonialism, that technological advantage inevitably led to exploitation, that the safest response to the unknown was preemptive hostility. Marina watched the military strategists construct their threat models and saw her own fatal flaw reflected in their reasoning. They were applying systems thinking to a scenario that might require entirely different frameworks, trying to solve a philosophical problem with tactical procedures. Corporate representatives arrived with different vocabulary but identical intentions. Representatives from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and a dozen smaller aerospace contractors Marina had never heard of, all carrying non-disclosure agreements and intellectual property claims drafted before the beacon's full implications were understood. They attended classified briefings where Chen Wei's archive translations were presented, and Marina watched their eyes track not the climate solutions or medical breakthroughs, but the propulsion systems and energy generation technologies. The economic implications of controlled access to this archive are unprecedented, explained Diane Rothman, Senior Vice President of something called Strategic Futures Division at an aerospace firm whose name was itself classified. We're talking about technology that could revolutionize global infrastructure, create entirely new industries, establish permanent American technological dominance, but only if access is properly managed through private sector partnerships that can move faster than government bureaucracy. The translation was transparent. Corporate control of alien technology, monetization of knowledge that had been offered freely, the transformation of humanity's welcome packet into proprietary intellectual property, generating shareholder value. Marina felt something like nausea settle into her stomach as she listened to Rothman outline licensing strategies for terraforming protocols that could save the planet, as though the solution to climate collapse were a product to be marketed rather than a survival imperative to be implemented. The information quarantine began failing on day 10, fractures appearing in containment that had been designed for terrestrial security threats rather than phenomena visible from 3 states. Amateur astronomers in New Jersey posted photographs of anomalous light emissions from Liberty Island, images that went viral before intelligence agencies could suppress them. News helicopters violated the exclusion zone, broadcasting footage of the torch's luminescence to audiences measuring in hundreds of millions. Religious organizations began issuing statements interpreting the beacon according to their respective eschatologies. The Archdiocese of New York called it divine revelation, evidence of God's cosmic plan extending beyond terrestrial humanity. Islamic scholars convened emergency councils to debate whether the Anunnaki qualified as jinn or represented an entirely new category of creation. Evangelical apocalyptics declared it proof of end-times prophecy, with the beacon cast as either angelic herald or demonic deception, depending on theological interpretation. Buddhist and Hindu leaders spoke of cosmic consciousness and the validation of beliefs in life's universal nature. Every tradition found ways to incorporate the phenomenon into existing frameworks, reinterpreting centuries of doctrine to accommodate what was happening above New York Harbor. Marina read the religious statements during sleepless hours in her temporary quarters, seeing humanity's desperate need to make the unknown comprehensible by forcing it into familiar categories. She recognized the impulse. It was her own systematic thinking translated into theological language, the same refusal to accept that some phenomena required new frameworks rather than application of existing ones. The discovery of the fail-safe mechanism came during Chen Wei's continued analysis of the beacon's base layer protocols, buried in the archive's metadata structures like a footer on a cosmic document. Marina was present when he decoded the conditional logic, watching as the implications materialized on his monitors in mathematical statements that required no translation to understand. "There's a secondary transmission mode," Chen Wei said, his voice carrying the flat effect of someone reporting something they wished were untrue. "If the crystalline lattice is destroyed before the Anunnaki arrival, the beacon sends a different signal. The archive includes the transmission protocol. It's a warning to the approaching ships. Premature civilization, quarantine recommended. They won't come. Earth gets flagged as not ready for contact, and we get passed over for reconsideration on a timeline measured in millennia, if ever." The choice collapsed into binary simplicity, invitation or cosmic isolation. Allow the beacon to continue and accept whatever first contact entailed, or destroy it and consign Earth to indefinite quarantine from galactic civilization. No middle ground, no graduated exposure, no systematic approach that allowed controlled integration. The Anunnaki had designed their test with deliberate starkness, forcing the civilizations they contacted to make an unambiguous choice about their cosmic future. Marina felt the weight of that binary settle into her consciousness like a physical burden. Every systematic instinct she possessed screamed for more data, more time, more analysis before committing to irreversible action. But the beacon's failsafe eliminated the possibility of cautious incrementalism. The choice demanded something her training had never developed: the capacity to make existential decisions with incomplete information and accept responsibility for consequences that couldn't be fully predicted. The federal mandate arrived on day 13, transmitted through chains of command that insulated decision-makers from direct confrontation with what their orders meant. Marina received notification that her infrastructure access was revoked effective immediately, her role reduced to supervised consultation with no independent authority. Chen Wei was detained by NSA security for violating information compartmentalization protocols, his equipment confiscated, his research classified, at levels that would prevent him from accessing his own data. Military engineers arrived with cutting equipment and shaped charges, specialists in controlled demolition who treated the torch structure with the clinical detachment of surgeons preparing to remove malignant tissue. They studied the crystalline lattice's integration with Eiffel's framework, calculating blast parameters that would destroy the alien technology while minimizing damage to the monument's historical structure. The operation was scheduled for 0600 the following morning, timed to occur before civilian astronomers could document the beacon's destruction. Marina watched the preparations from her quarters, confined to the museum level by security personnel, who treated her with polite firmness that communicated her complete irrelevance to the military operation now controlling Liberty Island. She'd become what she'd always been in her systematic worldview: a single component in a larger system, following protocols established by higher authority, executing her designated function without questioning the architecture of decisions made above her level of access. Except she possessed something none of the decision-makers in Pentagon command structures had: complete information. She understood Chen Wei's archived translations, knew the failsafe's implications, had read the Sumerian tablets describing the choice other civilizations had faced. She was the only person on Liberty Island, possibly the only person on Earth who comprehended all dimensions of what the beacon's destruction would mean. And she had absolutely no authority to act on that knowledge. The realization arrived with brutal clarity sometime after midnight, as Marina sat in her quarters watching security camera feeds of military engineers finalizing their demolition preparations. She'd been asking the wrong questions since the moment the phenomenon began. Not, "How does this work?" or "What are the technical specifications?" but "What does this mean? And how should humanity respond?" Her systematic thinking, her engineering perspective, her reliance on rational analysis, all of it was insufficient for a decision that was fundamentally philosophical rather than technical. She'd been trying to solve an epistemological problem with procedural methods, applying technical frameworks to questions that existed beyond the realm of systematic knowledge. The beacon wasn't malfunctioning infrastructure requiring repair. It was an invitation requiring wisdom. And wisdom, Marina realized with something approaching despair, was precisely what her training had never cultivated. The Sumerian tablets sat on her borrowed desk, Okonkwo's translations marked with annotations and cross-references. Marina read them again in the small hours before dawn, searching for clarity in text that had survived millennia to deliver its message to this specific moment. The tablets described 12 previous civilizations that had encountered Anunnaki beacons, their choices and consequences documented with the clinical precision of scientists recording experimental results. 7 had chosen isolation, destroying their beacons out of fear or skepticism or rational calculation that the risks of contact outweighed potential benefits. The tablets noted those civilizations' subsequent trajectories with concise finality: stagnation unto extinction for 5 of them, delayed transcendence achieved through independent development for 2. The process had taken those 2 civilizations an additional 8,000 years to achieve what the Anunnaki archive could have provided in generations, and both had lost billions to climate collapse and resource wars that could have been prevented with earlier access to advanced technologies. 5 had chosen contact, allowing their beacons to complete their transmissions and accepting the Anunnaki arrival. The tablets described those civilizations' transformations in language that suggested profound changes: integration into the cosmic community, transcendence of planetary limitations, evolution beyond biological constraints. But the descriptions were frustratingly vague about details, as though the changes were too fundamental to capture in language designed for pre-contact consciousness. The final entry held the key Marina had been seeking, buried in cuneiform that Okonkwo's translation rendered with careful literalness. The choice must be made freely without coercion, or it is meaningless. Civilizations that accept contact under duress or refuse it under compulsion fail the fundamental test: the capacity for collective self-determination in the face of cosmic consequence. The Seeders do not seek subjects or servants, but peers who have proven their maturity through the hardest decision: choosing transformation despite uncertainty, or choosing isolation despite temptation. Marina read that passage repeatedly, feeling its implications restructure everything she understood about her situation. The test wasn't about choosing correctly. It was about the capacity to choose at all, to exercise collective agency when facing consequences that couldn't be fully predicted. Humanity was being evaluated not on its decision, but on its decision-making process. its ability to confront existential uncertainty without retreating into either blind faith or paranoid isolation. And the current process, military mandate imposed without public consultation, decision made by classified authority insulated from democratic input, destruction scheduled before civilian awareness could enable collective response, was itself the failure condition. Humanity wasn't choosing isolation. A small fraction of humanity's power structure was choosing it, imposing that choice on everyone else through security classifications and chain of command authority. Marina stood in her quarters as false dawn began lightening the eastern sky, feeling the weight of complete understanding settle onto shoulders that had never been designed to carry it. She was the only person with comprehensive information about the beacon's nature, the archive's contents, the fail-safe's implications, and the Sumerian historical context. She was also the only person who completely lacked authority to act on that information, confined to quarters with her access revoked and her role reduced to irrelevance. The systematic answer was to accept her position in the hierarchy, trust that higher authority possessed wisdom she couldn't see, follow the protocols that had structured her entire professional life. But those protocols had been designed for normal operations, for scenarios where established procedures were sufficient. They'd never been designed for situations where the people with authority lacked the information necessary for informed decisions, where compartmentalized intelligence prevented comprehensive understanding, where the very process of decision-making was itself the thing being evaluated. Through her window, the torch blazed against the dawn sky, geometric patterns pulsing with the rhythm she'd learned to recognize as data transmission. The crystalline lattice was continuing its download, sending humanity's welcome packet across quantum-entangled channels to recipients who were already 47 years into their journey to Earth. In 3 hours, military engineers would destroy that transmission, send the fail-safe signal, and consign humanity to cosmic quarantine based on decisions made by people who didn't understand what they were choosing. Marina Kovač, systems engineer, procedural thinker, accidental gatekeeper of Earth's cosmic destiny, sat at rock bottom, understanding the complete inadequacy of everything her life had prepared her for. She'd spent 8 years maintaining infrastructure, believing that competence meant understanding systems and following procedures. But the beacon had revealed a deeper truth, that some moments required not procedural competence, but moral courage. Not systematic analysis, but philosophical choice. Not higher authority, but personal responsibility for consequences that couldn't be calculated in advance. The choice ahead of her wasn't technical. It was something far more terrifying. The decision to act without authority, to trust her incomplete understanding over others' incomplete authority, to accept responsibility for outcomes she couldn't predict. Everything in her training, her personality, her carefully constructed worldview argued against that kind of action. But everything she'd learned about the beacon, the archive, and the test humanity was failing argued that inaction was itself a choice, and the wrong one. Dawn continued brightening over New York Harbor, illuminating a monument that had always symbolized welcome and possibility. Somewhere in the torch's structure, a crystalline lattice transmitted its cosmic invitation, counting down the hours until military engineers would replace that invitation with a warning that humanity wasn't ready, would never be ready, had chosen isolation over the unknowable possibilities of transcendence. Marina stood at her window, watching the light, feeling the systematic frameworks that had structured her entire life finally, completely, irreversibly collapse under the weight of a decision no system could make for her. The Torch Museum existed as a small shrine of glass and copper at the monument's apex. Accessible through maintenance corridors, Marina had traversed 1,000 times in daylight competence. Now, she climbed those stairs in the pre-dawn darkness with legs that felt disconnected from conscious control, ascending toward a space that had become both sanctuary and trap. Behind her, somewhere in the levels below, demolition teams were conducting final equipment checks, military precision applied to the destruction of something they didn't understand, and she couldn't explain. The museum smelled of old metal and preserved history, display cases containing the original torch's copper segments replaced during the 1986 restoration. Marina stood among relics of past renovations, surrounded by fragments of the monument's evolution, and felt the crushing weight of unilateral decision-making settle into her chest like a physical mass. Whatever she chose, action or inaction, preservation or sabotage, she would be imposing her singular judgment on 8 billion people who deserved collective agency in determining their cosmic future. The logic spiraled in recursive loops that systematic thinking couldn't resolve. If she allowed the demolition, she would be complicit in humanity's cosmic isolation, passively accepting decisions made by authority structures that lacked comprehensive information. But if she prevented it, she would become exactly what she despised in those authority structures, someone imposing irreversible consequences on humanity without democratic mandate or collective consent. The Anunnaki test evaluated civilization's capacity for self-determination, but self-determination required collective choice, and collective choice required time humanity didn't have. Marina pressed her forehead against the museum's observation window, feeling the cold glass against her skin, watching the geometric light patterns pulse from the framework below. 3 hours until demolition, 47 years until arrival, and she stood alone in a small museum at the apex of a monument, carrying complete information and zero authority, facing a choice that systematic analysis couldn't make and democratic process didn't have time to conduct. Her mind catalogued the moral weights, like an engineer calculating load distribution. 7 billion would benefit from the archive's climate solutions, medical breakthroughs, energy technologies. But those same 7 billion included violent conflicts, genocidal movements, exploitation systems that treated human beings as resources to be extracted. The Anunnaki would encounter all of it. Humanity's capacity for compassion and its appetite for cruelty, its artistic transcendence and its systematic oppression. Was she condemning them to contact with a species still learning not to destroy itself? Or condemning humanity to isolation from knowledge that might accelerate that learning? The questions had no systematic answers. Every framework she applied revealed its own inadequacy. Utilitarian calculus couldn't weigh unknowable futures. Deontological ethics couldn't determine duties when facing unprecedented scenarios. Virtue ethics couldn't identify which virtues applied to cosmic-scale decisions. Her mind kept trying to solve a philosophical problem with engineering methods, searching for the correct procedure when the situation demanded something procedures couldn't provide. Epiphany arrived through peripheral vision. Through text she'd read 100 times without truly seeing. The Emma Lazarus sonnet inscribed on the pedestal below, bronze letters weathered by more than a century of harbour weather, visible through the museum's floor-level window. Marina had memorized those words during her first week on Liberty Island, filed them under historical context, and never reconsidered their relevance beyond tourism interpretation. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The words held different weight now, read through the lens of cosmic contact rather than terrestrial immigration. The Statue of Liberty had never been about safety or certainty or systematic evaluation of risk. It had been about welcoming the unknown, about taking the essential chance that diversity represented possibility rather than threat, about opening doors to people fleeing oppression and seeking transformation. Every immigrant ancestor had been an unknown variable, someone whose integration might fail or flourish, whose presence might strengthen or strain the communities they joined. And America's greatest achievements, its most significant innovations, its fundamental character, had emerged from that willingness to welcome uncertainty. Not because every outcome was positive, the history contained exploitation and discrimination alongside integration and innovation, but because the alternative was stagnation through fearful isolation. The same choice, Marina realized, that the Sumerian tablets described civilizations facing when confronted with Anunnaki beacons, isolation's safety or transformation's risk, the tired certainty of remaining planetary or the exhausting possibility of becoming cosmic. The monument itself was providing the answer, had been providing it for 139 years. Humanity's symbolic declaration of what it claimed to value, not fortress walls or defensive isolation, but a torch illuminating harbor darkness to guide strangers toward welcome. If that symbolism meant anything beyond tourist revenue and diplomatic rhetoric, if the values inscribed on the pedestal represented authentic human aspiration rather than performative ideals, then the choice wasn't actually difficult. The real question was whether Marina possessed the courage to trust humanity's stated values over its authority structure's fears, to act on philosophical conviction rather than procedural compliance, to accept responsibility for consequences she couldn't control. Everything in her systematic worldview argued against that kind of action. But her systematic worldview had already proven insufficient for the situation she faced. Marina descended from the museum at 4:47 hours, 23 minutes before scheduled demolition commencement. The maintenance corridors were empty, security personnel concentrated at the torch structure where demolition teams were conducting final preparations. She moved through darkness, illuminated only by the framework's geometric glow, her hands finding familiar surfaces through muscle memory accumulated across 4 years of infrastructure maintenance. The fire suppression system controls were located in a junction box on the pedestal's 3rd level, redundant manual overrides installed after the 1916 explosion that had damaged the statue's arm. Marina accessed the panel using her infrastructure credentials, which hadn't yet been revoked from the physical security system despite her access suspension. Her fingers moved across controls she could operate blindfolded, entering the override sequence that would activate full building suppression protocols. The halon system engaged with a hiss that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed corridor, odorless gas flooding through ventilation networks designed to protect historical artifacts from fire damage. Alarm klaxons began wailing, emergency lighting switching to evacuation mode, automated announcements directing all personnel to designated muster points outside the building structure. Marina felt the system respond to her commands the way systems had always responded, predictably, mechanically, without judgment about whether the crisis was genuine or manufactured. She heard demolition teams evacuating above her, military discipline overriding mission focus when fire suppression protocols activated. The halon wasn't dangerous at exposure levels designed for occupied buildings, but military safety procedures required immediate evacuation regardless. Marina counted seconds, giving them time to clear the torch structure, her heart rate elevated, but her hands steady. This was still technical action, still something her engineering background could execute with competent precision. The lattice chamber occupied a space behind the Torch Museum that hadn't existed in Bartholdi's original design, a cavity formed where Eiffel's iron framework cradled the crystalline structure. Marina accessed it through a maintenance hatch that required 3 separate tool operations to open, security through obscurity rather than sophisticated locks. Janway had shown her the beacon's interface during their covert research, a contact surface that responded to touch with visual feedback, suggesting control parameters. She entered the chamber at 0502 hours, 13 minutes before scheduled demolition, and confronted the crystalline lattice with absolutely no plan beyond preventing its destruction. The structure pulsed with internal luminescence, geometric patterns cycling through configurations that hurt to observe directly. Chen Wei's equipment remained scattered around the chamber, confiscated but not yet removed. Monitoring gear still displaying data streams, showing the archived downloads continued acceleration. Marina placed her hand against the lattice's surface and felt it respond to her touch. Warmth spreading across her palm, visual patterns shifting in ways that suggested communication. The interface recognized intention without requiring language. Chen Wei had described it as intuitive, but Marina experienced it as something more profound, as though the beacon could read purpose directly from nervous system impulses and translate human volition into its own operational parameters. She could disable it. The fail-safe protocol was accessible, a simple gesture Chen Wei had identified during their analysis, a way to shut down the transmission and trigger the cosmic quarantine signal. 3 seconds of contact with specific intention and humanity's invitation would become humanity's isolation, the choice made through her agency alone. Or she could preserve it unchanged, maintaining the original transmission, accepting whatever the Anunnaki arrival would mean, without modification or input. 47 years to prepare for contact with an intelligence that possessed the archive's knowledge, but lacked context about humanity's violence, beauty, confusion, aspiration, all the complexity that couldn't be encoded in technical specifications. The third option materialized not as systematic analysis, but as intuitive understanding, transmitted through the interface's contact. The beacon wasn't a fixed system. It was an adaptive communication protocol designed to carry not just the Anunnaki's message, but the contacted civilization's response. Marina could modify the transmission, add humanity's own introduction to the signal stream, provide context that the technical archive alone couldn't communicate. Her fingers moved across the lattice surface with gestures that felt simultaneously alien and natural, the interface responding to intentions she hadn't fully consciously formulated. She accessed the beacon's transmission protocols and began uploading humanity's additions, drawing from the very confiscation equipment Chen Wei's work had required. Human mathematics, not just the Anunnaki's solutions, but Earth's independent discoveries, proof of cognitive capacity developed without external assistance. Human art, Beethoven's Ninth, Hokusai's Wave, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, images that communicated aesthetic sense and creative transcendence. Human conflict, photographs of Hiroshima, the Holocaust, Rwanda, evidence of the species' capacity for systematic destruction. Human compassion, field hospitals, refugee rescue operations, strangers protecting strangers, evidence that the same species could choose solidarity over violence. She included the Emma Lazarus sonnet, bronze letters transmitting across quantum-entangled channels to recipients already en route. She included the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, aspirational principles humanity kept violating and kept striving to honor. She included climate data showing Earth's atmospheric collapse and the tentative, insufficient efforts to reverse it. If the Anunnaki came, they would meet the real humanity, flawed, striving, violent, compassionate, brilliant, ignorant, beautiful, terrible. Not an idealized version curated to impress cosmic judgment, but the authentic complexity of a species still learning to transcend its limitations. The modification required 8 minutes of continuous contact. Marina's hand pressed against the lattice surface while the interface translated her intentions into transmission protocols. She felt the beacon accept her additions, felt them integrate into the signal stream already propagating through quantum entanglement toward the approaching ships. The archive download continued unchanged. Humanity would still receive the Anunnaki's welcome packet, the technologies and knowledge offered freely to contacted civilizations. But now, that offering would arrive with context, with humanity's authentic introduction, with a message that communicated autonomy and agency rather than passive reception. She completed the modification at 0514 hours, 1 minute before scheduled demolition, and felt the transmission confirm successful integration. The signal was irreversible now. Quantum-entangled information already received by the Anunnaki fleet decades into their journey. Invitation accepted, but with humanity's authentic voice included, a declaration that Earth civilization chose contact as themselves rather than as someone else's idealized recipients. The chamber door breached at 5:15 hours, federal agents entering with weapons drawn, and voices demanding immediate compliance. Marina raised her hands, stepping away from the lattice, feeling something like peace settle into her chest despite the immediate consequences she faced. She'd made the choice her systematic training said was impossible: unilateral action affecting humanity's cosmic destiny, imposition of her singular judgment on collective future. But she'd made it in service of authenticity and agency, trusting that humanity's best chance at successful contact required meeting the Anunnaki as flawed reality rather than curated fiction. The arrests came swiftly. Federal charges for sabotaging classified operations, interference with national security procedures, unauthorized modification of strategic assets. Marina didn't resist, didn't attempt justification or explanation. The systematic framework would judge her actions as criminal. She'd violated chain of command, exceeded her authority, imposed irreversible consequences through individual choice. But the philosophical framework she'd finally learned to access judged differently. She'd preserved humanity's agency by ensuring the invitation included human voice, had prevented isolation while maintaining authenticity, had chosen transformation over safety, because the monument she'd maintained for 4 years had always symbolized that choice. The beacon continued transmitting as federal agents escorted her from the chamber, its modified signal propagating across quantum channels that collapsed distance into simultaneity. Somewhere in interstellar space, 47 years of travel time ahead of them, the Anunnaki were receiving humanity's authentic introduction, learning that Earth's civilization chose contact while simultaneously revealing all the reasons that choice was complicated, difficult, dangerous, and necessary. The immediate aftermath arrived as predictable chaos. Marina's actions couldn't remain classified once the beacon's modification became evident, couldn't be contained within military intelligence compartmentalization when the transmission itself was the story. Journalists who'd been covering the Liberty Island phenomenon from outside the exclusion zone now had the essential detail. The beacon had been modified, its transmission altered by someone inside the quarantine, humanity's cosmic introduction rewritten by unauthorized action. The story propagated faster than any containment protocol could suppress it, global media coverage transforming Marina from anonymous systems engineer into the woman who'd chosen humanity's cosmic future without permission. Global opinion fractured along every conceivable divide. Religious leaders debated whether her action constituted blasphemy or providence. Political authorities condemned unauthorized interference with diplomatic procedures. Scientists argued about whether modification corrupted or enhanced the communication protocol. Philosophers published essays exploring the ethics of unilateral decisions affecting collective destiny. Public polling showed contradictory majorities supporting both her prosecution and her protection, humanity demonstrating its characteristic inability to reach consensus even when facing existential questions. But beneath the fractured public discourse, something else was happening. Chenwei's archive translations were leaked, deliberately by sources Marina never identified, providing global access to the Anunnaki knowledge base. Research institutions began carefully integrating the archive's solutions, climate scientists adapting terraforming protocols, medical researchers analyzing the cellular regeneration technologies, engineers studying the fusion reactor specifications. The knowledge was freely available, as the Anunnaki had designed it to be, and humanity began the slow, cautious, fractious work of incorporating cosmic solutions to planetary problems. Marina spent 14 months in federal detention while prosecutors assembled charges. Global consensus debated her fate, and diplomatic procedures attempted to establish frameworks for managing modified first contact scenarios. The detention was comfortable as imprisonment went, protective custody rather than punitive incarceration, isolation from both vengeful authority and fanatical supporters. She spent the time reading philosophical texts she'd never prioritized during her systematic education, learning frameworks for ethical reasoning that her engineering training had never included, developing the wisdom her crisis had demanded, too late for her to possess during the moment that required it. Release came not through legal proceedings, but through diplomatic necessity. Global consensus emerged slowly that Marina's action, however controversial, had preserved humanity's agency in ways military containment would have eliminated. She'd prevented both cosmic isolation and passive acceptance, had chosen invitation while maintaining authentic voice, had acted without authority, but in service of values the monument she'd maintained had always represented. The charges were dismissed through executive clemency that satisfied no one and allowed everyone to claim vindication, bureaucratic compromise applied to philosophical crisis. She returned to Liberty Island not as systems engineer, but as historical consultant, technical advisor to the monument that had become humanity's active beacon to the cosmos. The torch continued transmitting, its modified signal carrying humanity's ongoing evolution toward whatever the Anunnaki arrival would mean. Marina stood on the observation platform, where she'd first witnessed the framework's activation, watching geometric light patterns pulse against the night sky, and felt the weight of her choice settle into permanent residence in her consciousness. 47 years stretched ahead, half a century for humanity to mature into the civilization it had introduced itself as, time to address the violence and oppression she'd included in her honest introduction, decades to determine whether contact would arrive to meet a species transcending its limitations or confirming its stagnation. Marina would be elderly when the Anunnaki fleet reached Earth's orbit, would witness the culmination of the choice she'd made without authority, would learn whether her trust in humanity's stated values had been justified or naive. She imagined that distant future, constructed its details with the same systematic precision she'd once applied to infrastructure maintenance. Herself at 84, standing on Liberty Island while telescopes detected the approaching fleet, the torch blazing with alien light, visible to the whole world watching. No military quarantine this time, no classified operations, no compartmentalized authority making decisions for humanity's collective future. Instead, preparation and unity built through decades of careful integration of the archive's knowledge, through slow maturation toward wisdom rather than just technical capability, through collective choice to meet contact as the flawed, striving, compassionate, violent, beautiful species they'd introduced themselves as. The beacon's light reflected in her eyes, cyan luminescence mixing with the natural brown until her gaze seemed to hold both terrestrial and cosmic illumination. She'd given humanity that half-century through her unauthorized action, had preserved agency while accepting consequences, had chosen transformation over safety because the monument she'd maintained had always symbolized that the unknown deserved welcome rather than defensive isolation. Whether it had been enough remained unknowable for 47 years, But Marina Kovac, systems engineer, evolved into philosophical decision-maker, accidental gatekeeper who'd refused that role's isolation, stood at the threshold of Earth's cosmic future and felt something her systematic training had never recognized as valuable, not certainty, but meaningful uncertainty. The choice to invite the Anunnaki as humanity truly was, to risk contact without the safety of curated perfection, to trust that authenticity offered better foundation for transformation than idealized fiction. The torch blazed above her, transmitting humanity's honest introduction across quantum-entangled channels that had already delivered that message to recipients who would arrive in her lifetime to evaluate whether the species they encountered matched the species that had invited them. Marina watched the light pulse with respiratory rhythm, carrying human mathematics and human atrocities, human art and human genocide, human compassion and human exploitation, everything the species was and aspired to become, and felt the peace that comes not from knowing you chose correctly, but from knowing you chose honestly, with full acceptance of consequences unknowable but no longer unimaginable. The beacon transmitted through the night, through the years ahead, through the decades until arrival, carrying its hybrid message of Anunnaki welcome and human introduction toward recipients already traveling, already receiving, already evaluating whether Earth deserved integration or isolation, contact or quarantine, the transformation its monument had always symbolized, or the safety its fears demanded. Marina stood watch over that transmission, guardian of the choice she'd made without authority and with complete responsibility, and waited with her species for the answer only time and arrival would provide.